In the quiet corners of a modest Houston neighborhood, there was a girl who hummed to herself when no one was listening. Her voice did not yet fill stadiums. It barely filled the small rooms of her family's home. But there was something raw, fragile, and strangely unsettling about it. She was Beyoncé Giselle Knowles, though at that time her name meant nothing to the world. She was only a child of ordinary streets, a daughter of Tina, a hairdresser with roughened hands, and Matthew, a man with big dreams that rarely aligned with the paycheck he brought home. At night, when the city lights dimmed and silence crept in, Beyoncé would lie awake, staring at the ceiling fan that turned with slow exhaustion. She wondered if the melodies in her head mattered. They came to her like whispers soft, persistent, sometimes haunting. But she had no proof that her voice was anything more than noise. Around her, the world did not ask for art. It demanded survival. And survival meant keeping your head down, finding steady work, staying out of trouble. Yet she was restless. She could feel it in her bones even then, a longing too sharp to ignore. Her childhood was not defined by hunger or complete destitution, but by a constant awareness of limits. Every dollar counted, every sacrifice weighed. Tina worked long hours at the salon, her body aching, but her spirit unwilling to break, while Matthew studied numbers and strategies, clinging to an idea that one day their family would rise. For Beyoncé, this atmosphere of quiet struggle planted a seed. She watched her parents bend, but not shatter. And somewhere in her young mind, she began to believe that bending was not enough. She wanted to break free. She was shy, painfully so. In school, her voice barely rose above a whisper. Teachers mistook her silence for indifference. Classmates often overlooked her. But when music played, something inside her cracked open. In church, when the choir sang, she felt her chest tremble with a force she couldn't explain. One evening, Tina took her to a small local talent show. Beyoncé, clutching the microphone with hands damp from nerves, stood frozen at first. Then the music began. The fear was still there, but her voice pushed through it, pure, strong, piercing. The room changed. People looked up, startled by the sound coming from such a timid girl. Applause followed, but more important than that was the way her heart raced. For the first time, she tasted what it meant to be seen. It was intoxicating, but also dangerous. Because once you know you can be seen, it's impossible to return to the comfort of invisibility. Her father noticed immediately. Matthew Knowles was not the kind of man to let potential slip by. He began crafting a plan, a fragile blueprint that mixed ambition with desperation. He saw in Beyoncé's voice not just talent, but a ticket out of the quiet mediocrity that had trapped so many families before them. He began to push, sometimes gently, sometimes with the weight of obsession. Vocal lessons, rehearsals, auditions. Beyoncé learned early that talent alone was never enough. It had to be sharpened, disciplined, weaponized. But childhood is not meant for discipline alone. Friends played outside, free of burden, while Beyoncé repeated the same lines, the same notes, until her throat ached. She resented it at times, the weight of expectation that pressed against her small shoulders. Yet deep down, she also craved it. The duality became her silent companion, resentment and desire, discipline and longing. The first real step came with a group, Girls' Time, a collection of hopeful children assembled into something that looked, at least on the surface, like destiny in motion. They trained in dance studios, sang in cramped rooms, performed in places that barely resembled stages. To outsiders, it seemed like harmless fun, but to Beyoncé, every rehearsal felt like a test of survival. She was not just competing against others. She was competing against herself, her fear, her shyness, the voice that told her she was still just a little girl from Houston with nothing to offer. Then came the television appearance, Star Search, a moment that was supposed to define the beginning. The lights were blinding, the cameras unflinching. Beyoncé stood there with the group, dressed in matching costumes, the dream so close she could almost touch it. And then defeat. They lost. Publicly, visibly, brutally. The applause belonged to someone else. That night, she cried until her body ached. She felt humiliated, her voice drowned in the sound of failure. The whispers in her head, once soft, grew cruel. Maybe you are nothing. Maybe you will always be nothing. For a child, such failure can crush the spirit. But for Beyoncé, it carved a scar that never healed. She carried it like a secret wound, hidden beneath every note she sang from then on. Failure has a way of splitting people in two. Some retreat, convincing themselves that they were foolish to try. Others push harder, not out of confidence, but out of fear of being seen as a failure forever. Beyoncé chose the latter. Or perhaps it chose her. Because in the silence after defeat, she realized something terrifying. She still wanted it. Even after humiliation, even after the sting of rejection, the hunger did not fade. It only grew sharper. But hunger is costly. Matthew left his corporate job to manage the group, plunging the family into financial uncertainty. Tina carried the weight of their survival on her back, working longer hours while resentment brewed in the extended family. People whispered, "He gave up stability for a childish dream. She is just a little girl. This will ruin them." Every failure, every missed opportunity, echoed louder because now the stakes were survival itself. Beyoncé felt the pressure with every breath. Her parents' sacrifices wrapped around her throat like an invisible rope. If she failed, it was not just her own dream collapsing. It was her family's stability, their dignity, their very sense of worth. Nights were restless. She rehearsed until her legs trembled, her voice cracking, her body aching. At times she wanted to scream, to run, to abandon it all. But she didn't. She couldn't. Because even in the exhaustion, there were moments, brief, fleeting, when her voice carried her into something beyond pain. A state of pure connection, where she was not just a girl, not just a daughter, but something larger, something undeniable. The group changed. Members left, others arrived. They stumbled through rejections, endured closed doors, faced endless criticism. At auditions, executives would dismiss them with a glance, their words sharp, their laughter colder. Beyoncé absorbed it all. The rejection carved her from the inside, molding her into someone harder, sharper, less forgiving. Each no became fuel, but also poison, because to be fueled by rejection is to live haunted by it. Still, cracks of light appeared. Small performances turned into whispers of recognition. There were nights when the crowd clapped not out of politeness, but out of genuine awe. A first demo recorded, rough and imperfect, but enough to hint at something real. Each step forward was fragile, constantly at risk of collapse, yet undeniably present. And then Destiny's Child, a new name, a new formation, but still carrying the ghosts of past failures. It was not triumph, not yet, just a possibility. But for Beyoncé, possibility was enough, because she knew by now that beginnings are always fragile, always uncertain, always drenched in doubt. What mattered was that she was still moving. The first true victory came quietly. A small performance where for once the applause lingered. It was not thunderous, not world-changing, but it felt different. It felt earned. For Beyoncé, it was proof that she could rise above the silence of humiliation, above the laughter of those who dismissed her. It was fragile, yes, but it was real. And in that fragility, she found her first taste of power. But even as the applause echoed, she could not forget the nights of doubt, the sacrifices of her parents, the faces of those who said she would never be more than a girl with a loud voice from Houston. The victory was sweet, but it carried a bitter aftertaste, the knowledge that every step forward demanded another risk, another sacrifice, Another chance to fall. In the shadows of her first triumph, Beyoncé understood something that would define her forever. Beginnings are not defined by glory. They are defined by the willingness to bleed for something that no one else believes in. The applause from that first small victory still echoed in her chest long after the stage had gone dark. Yet Beyoncé knew better than to mistake it for security. Applause fades quickly. One night you're celebrated, the next morning you're forgotten. She had seen it before, had felt it after Star Search, the way cheers can evaporate, leaving only silence. And silence was crueler than failure, because it reminded her of how invisible she could still be. The transition into Destiny's Child was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of fragile rebirth. With every rehearsal, every endless repetition of choreography and harmonies, Beyoncé carried the weight of something larger than herself. She wasn't just singing anymore, she was fighting. Fighting for her father's decision, for her mother's sacrifices, for her own voice that refused to be silenced. But the world does not hand victories easily, especially not to young black girls from Houston. The industry doors opened slowly, reluctantly, as if testing their resolve. Meetings with executives were filled with skepticism, polite nods masking dismissal. Beyoncé and the group often left those rooms with forced smiles, only to collapse in tears once the doors closed. The humiliation was endless. Sometimes it was crueler than outright rejection. Sometimes it was the cold indifference that hurt the most. Still, Matthew kept pushing, his obsession tightening like a vice. He was not a gentle guide. He was relentless, demanding. Beyoncé absorbed his intensity. She trained harder, longer, until exhaustion became a second skin. Her shyness had no place in this life anymore. She had to kill it, bury it, replace it with something sharper. Every performance became a battlefield where she had to prove herself worthy, not just to the crowd, but to herself. Yet in private, she still doubted. Nights were restless, her mind filled with questions. What if it never worked? What if she was sacrificing her youth, her friendships, her very identity for a dream that would collapse like sand? The weight of that possibility was crushing. She could hear it in her own voice when she rehearsed too long, the notes cracking, betraying her exhaustion. She cried in silence, wiping tears quickly so no one would see. Because weakness was dangerous. Weakness meant maybe the whispers were right, that she was not enough. Then came the first true opportunity. A record deal, fragile, uncertain, but real. Signing the papers felt like stepping into another world, one filled with promises and shadows. For Beyoncé, it was validation, but also fear, because promises in the music industry often came wrapped in knives. The group's first songs were released into a world that barely noticed. There was no explosion of fame, no overnight transformation, just small sparks in the darkness, easily extinguished. Reviews were harsh, dismissive. Some called them unoriginal, forgettable. The sting of those words lingered. Beyoncé felt the old wounds of rejection reopening. She wondered if she was destined to live in a cycle of almost close enough to touch the dream, but never close enough to hold it. But then came No, 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 a single that, against the odds, began to catch fire. Radio stations played it, people hummed along, and suddenly the world tilted. The shift was small at first, but unmistakable. For the first time, Beyoncé's voice was not just echoing in rehearsal rooms or fading in small venues. It was on airwaves, it was in cars, it was in homes. She was no longer invisible. That success, fragile though it was, became oxygen. It kept her moving through the exhaustion, through the endless rehearsals, through the brutal schedule that consumed her youth. But with visibility came new wounds. Critics dissected them, strangers speculated, and betrayal lurked even within the group itself. Members left, friendships fractured. The spotlight illuminated them, but it also burned. For Beyoncé, It was both heaven and hell. She stood on stages now where the crowd roared for her, the sound so loud it rattled her bones. And yet, backstage, she was still that girl who once lost on Star Search, still haunted by the possibility that it could all vanish again. She lived with one foot in triumph and the other in fear. Every victory felt temporary, every success fragile. The first true taste of fame did not bring peace, it brought chaos. Endless tours, constant scrutiny, pressure to be perfect. She was barely out of adolescence, yet the world demanded she carry herself like an icon. Mistakes were not allowed. Vulnerability was not allowed. She crafted a mask of strength, of confidence, of power, but behind it she often felt hollow. Nights alone in hotel rooms, staring at ceilings that looked unfamiliar, wondering if she was losing herself in the very dream she had bled for. She learned quickly that success was not freedom. Success was another kind of cage. The bars were gilded, but they were still bars. And yet, she stayed, because leaving was unthinkable. She had sacrificed too much, carried too much, to abandon it now. There was a moment small, fleeting, but unforgettable. After a concert, as the crowd screamed her name, Beyoncé stood on stage and felt tears press against her eyes. Not from joy, but from the strange, haunting realization that she had survived the first steps. The humiliation, the sacrifices, the long nights of doubt, they had not broken her. They had scarred her, yes, but they had also carved her into something unshakable. The applause that night was thunderous, louder than anything she had ever heard before. Yet as she walked backstage, the sound already fading behind her, she whispered to herself, "Remember the silence. Remember when no one believed," because she knew that silence was the true beginning. Her story was not about sudden glory. It was about the shadows she walked through, the nights she almost gave up, the weight she carried when no one else believed she could. Those first steps, awkward, painful, humiliating, were the foundation of everything. Without them, there would be no stages, no crowds, no legacy. And in that truth lies the darkest and most powerful lesson of all. The beginning is never glorious. It is lonely. It is humiliating. It is drenched in sacrifice and doubt. But it is also where strength is born. Beyoncé's journey from that timid girl in Houston to the edge of stardom was not about destiny. It was about endurance. About refusing to let the whispers of failure silence her. About carrying the scars of rejection as proof that she had dared to try. She would go on to conquer the world, to become a name spoken in every corner of the globe. But none of it would ever erase the memory of the first step, the fragile victory, the humiliating defeat, the endless silence of being unseen. And perhaps that is why her story resonates. Because in every beginning, no matter how small, how painful, how uncertain, there is a reflection of our own. The reminder that greatness is not born in comfort. It is born in the dark, when no one is watching, when the world doubts you, when the only voice left to believe in is your own. That is the price of the first step. It demands everything and promises nothing. It leaves you scarred, uncertain, and often alone. But for those who take it, for those who endure, it opens a door that otherwise remains forever closed. And Beyoncé, the girl once overlooked, once humiliated, once silenced, chose to walk through that door, not because she was fearless, but because even in her fear, even in her doubt, she refused to stop. And that is how the beginning of her empire was written, fragile, dark, uncertain, yet unforgettable.